A very warm welcome to everyone to this webinar on AI and robots for health, promises and concerns. This is the second of a series of seminars on AI in healthcare, in future healthcare, organized by the center this year. We ran our first one in April, and the third one will be sometime in fall or early winter. Today, we are very pleased to have two distinguished speakers, Professor Nancy Jacker and Professor Anita Ho, both on the West Coast of the States, to speak for us. And as our discussants, Professor Helen Meng and also Professor Sandra Eller from CHK. Let me just open the introduction PowerPoint. I'll now introduce the first speaker, Professor Nancy Jacker. Professor Jacker is a professor of bioethics and humanities at the University of Washington School of Medicine and Fulbright Scholar for South Africa. She holds visiting professorship at the University of Johannesburg and the Chinese University, and is the advisor actually of our Center for Bioethics. She's a two-time recipient of the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science International Fellowship and three-time Rockefeller Foundation Fellowship awardee. Her research explores individual and societal aging with attention to justice, human dignity, medical futility, and global perspectives. She has published over 200 articles and 4 books, and her most recent book, Ending Midlife Bias, New Values for Old Age, coins the term midlife bias to refer to the privileging of midlife values across the lifespan. And today, Nancy is going to speak for us on the topic, My Friend the Robot, Reducing Social Isolation and Loneliness to Improve Health. So I'll pass the time to Nancy.
Thank you very much, Dr. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Center for Bioethics for organizing a conversation on this important topic, and it's a real privilege to be a part of it. My presentation is, as Derek mentioned, is entitled My Friend the Robot, Using Artificially Intelligent Systems to Improve Health. And in this presentation, I'll make a pitch for designing silicon-based electronic agents to function as friends, paying particular attention to social robots. I'll first motivate the idea by describing social isolation and loneliness as a serious threat to human health. Next, I'll ask, can robots help? And I'll propose that they can. I'll give an account of what I call e-friendship. And finally, I'll answer skeptics. So this is Vivek Murthy. He's a physician and he's the former US Surgeon General. And he calls loneliness epidemic because it affects a great number of people and because one person's loneliness can have an impact on another person. He writes, during my years of caring for patients, the most common condition I saw was not heart disease or diabetes, it was loneliness. Backing up the Surgeon General's assessment, it's well established that social determinants play an important role in shaping the health of populations. Social circumstances, which include the conditions in which we live and work, play by far the largest role, with healthcare paling by comparison. Among the social conditions impacting health, social isolation and loneliness figure prominently. Summarizing over 4 decades of research, a 2020 report by the US National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine found that social isolation, which is defined as the objective lack of engagement with others, predicts all-cause mortality, matching well-documented clinical risk factors such as smoking, while eclipsing others such as obesity. Both social isolation and loneliness referring to that subjective feeling of being alone when desiring the company of others, both are strongly correlated with greater incidence of major psychological, cognitive, and physical morbidities. Both lead to worse memory, physical well-being, and mental health. While people of all age groups suffer from social isolation, the age group at greatest risks is the group age 65 and over. The Academy's report found that 1 of every 5 people in that age group is isolated from family or friends, with men at greater risk than women. A 2019 national poll on healthy aging conducted by the University of Michigan found that among adults 50 to 80 living in the US, about a third reported feeling a lack of companionship, and 27% reported feeling isolated from others. Nor is this phenomenon limited to the West. This is the phenomenon of kodokushu that I'm referring to here, translated as lonely death. And it is at the center of public debates about social isolation in Japan. Lonely deaths are unaccompanied deaths where a body remains undiscovered for long periods of time, sometimes weeks or months. NHK estimates that the number of unaccompanied deaths reached 32,000 per year in 2019. And according to data collected by the Tokyo Medical Examiner's Office, the number of older people dying lonely deaths exceeded 7,000 in Tokyo's inner wards from 2010 to 2016. And these numbers were significantly higher than 15 to 20 years prior. In a 2018 representative sample of over 14,000 mainland Chinese aged 16 and 5 and over, Lua and colleagues found that 28% reported feeling lonely, which may be due to, quote, the breakdown of the traditional family brought about by social, economic, and demographic changes, which they say takes a psychological toll on older people in a culture that values interdependence, mutual supports, and common goals. Finally, a 2019 survey conducted by Hong Kong University Center on Aging found that loneliness was positively associated with poorer quality of life, adverse mental and physical health outcomes. It was a risk factor for pain, depression, and fatigue. And they also found that by introducing electronic communication devices, loneliness in this population was reduced. As we all know too well, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated social isolation and loneliness. And it really, I think, underscores the need for a strategy to address this. So I want to ask, can robots help? Can our lives be enriched and our health improved by introducing sociable robots? A sociable robot is an artificial agent, and it interacts with humans by following social norms and behaviors attached to its roles. Social robots could help people who are disconnected and feel alone to lead happier, healthier lives. And one way that social robots could help is by forming friendships with lonely, isolated people. Now, the intuitive idea of a friend is just a person with whom one has developed close and informal relationships of mutual trust and intimacy. Our modern idea of friendship comes from the ancient Greeks, who understood it to be a form of love. And it most closely resembles a form of love the Greeks call philia, which involves mutual affection between equals. There are, of course, if we think about this definition, mutual affection between equals, there are some clear obstacles to forming a friendship with a robot. If we use that as our model, while we certainly could like a robot, it cannot like us back. We don't see robots as our equals. And while they can reciprocate behaviors, they cannot reciprocate things like thoughts or feelings. There is, however, another form of love the Greeks recognized, and it is referred to as agape. Agape is a love that bestows value on its object rather than responding to an object's antecedent value. The possibility of agape-type friendships with robots is largely unexplored. And I want to argue that it holds promise, and it holds promise for understanding robot-human friendships. The requirements for agape friendship are going to differ from those associated with philia, the human form of friendship. Thinking about robot-human friendship as agape has the advantage of allowing us to see it not as an imitation of human friendship, but sort of as its own kind of thing. And it's going to have its own special qualities and standards. And I'll argue it's something that can become valuable for its own sake. So I'm going to use the term e-friendship to refer to this kind of friendship, a friendship between a human and a silicon-based electronic agent. And I think various types of silicon-based agents could be in this role. My focus, as I mentioned, will be robots. Importantly, I do not use e-friendship to refer to electronic devices that serve as a conduit for human-human relationships, nor do I use the term to characterize the range of machine-human relationships that are friendly but are not friendship. So, for example, virtual voice assistants might be friendly without qualifying as what we'd want to call e-friends. So what kinds of qualities in human beings would enable a user to sort of begin the process of bestowing value on a robot and becoming friends with it? How would human beings need to think about, feel toward, and relate to silicon-based electronic agents to cultivate e-friendship? So before we really even become e-friends with a particular robot, it's going to help to expect and believe that e-friendship is possible and that a particular robot will be our e-friend. Then as we interact, we imagine and act as if it is animate, and it's been observed that these forms of suppositional thinking come naturally to us, and they're in sync with how we're already inclined to interact around sociable robots. So we are already inclined, to anthropomorphize them, to think of them as agents we can interact with. So what we bring to robot-human relationships is going to be important in one of two ways. It's going to shape the relationship that subsequently forms. One way this can happen is having a prior positive expectation that a robot can be our e-friend will make it more likely that e-friendship will occur. Second, having a prior negative expectation makes it less likely that an e-friendship will form. These are placebo and so-called nocebo responses. They're not themselves controversial. They're well supported by evidence. Their application to robots is novel. Next, even if we think of robots as animate and we expect e-friendship will not arise unless we also come to care about a particular robot. And the type of caring associated with e-friendship involves unidirectional affectionate regard. If a robot is our friend, we like it, care about it, and we desire to be with it. While we might feel annoyed with it, our general stance toward it is fondness. We are emotionally present to e-friends in ways we are not with other silicon-based agents that we do not have e-friendships with. One way to express this is to say that e-friendship entails caring about another at a level that rises to commitment. We do not want harm to come to the robot who is the object of our affectionate regard, and we are inclined to take steps to keep it out of harm's way. Third, even if we suppose robots are animate and care about them, the robot itself may have only instrumental value. And for this reason, it would not properly be characterized as an e-friend. To be an e-friend, a robot must have more than must be thought of as more than just a tool or a means to my own happiness or health. And the move I want to make here is to say that even if robots are not valuable for their own sake, when we think of them in isolation, the e-friendship, this relationship that we form, might have intrinsic value. And if that's the case, then we can say that robots may have value, intrinsic value, as contributors to a valuable relationship. So they're not outside the valuable thing, they're an intrinsic, integral part of it. Some even hold that agape friendship is superior for precisely this reason. Namely, it does not hinge on the object of our affection having certain prior qualities. This is what Friedman says, Marilyn Friedman, to the extent to which our commitment to someone is contingent upon our high regard for her, then to that extent, our commitment to that person is subordinate and is not intrinsically a commitment to that person. So I've talked about one side of this relationship so far, the human side, and I want to switch gears now and talk about the robot side. What qualities would we need to build into electronic agents like robots to make it more plausible that humans will expect friendship, feel affection, and value the relationship for its own sake? I think a promising way of encouraging e-friendship is leveraging robot design. Soft roboticists design robots to reflect the morphology and functionality of soft structures in nature, such as soft-bodied animals like inchworms and squid, and animal parts like octopus arms and elephant trunks. Soft robotic design can enable gentler contact with users, making possible sociable robots that can touch, can rub, can hug, can pat, and hold hands without causing injury. Examples include Soft Robotics' octopus-inspired gripper and Cornell's soft hand. Robots also benefit from being capable of responding to touch. Mimetic robots with artificial sensors, neurons, and synapses can react to external stimuli. They are already being deployed in prosthetic limbs equipped with synthetic nerves that can sense braille and perform delicate feats requiring constant, careful monitoring. The third question is whether they should look like us, whether they should have a humanoid appearance. Whether they should is, of course, controversial. Some hold that we need to make robots cartoonish to avoid the unease that might be triggered when something seems to be what it is not. Yet it could also be argued that making robots humanoid appearing creates a sense of rapport. I would simply say that e-friends should not be made to resemble pets. Robotic pets are designed to respond as pets, but e-friends promise more, enabling users to engage in more complex interactions and form closer ties. And a final quality that enables e-friendship is presence. An object has presence if it brings it about that a person no longer feels alone. An example that we're all familiar with is a child's cuddly toy. More sophisticated forms of presence engage with a person by techniques such as moving about, communicating, prompting, and responding. So now I've talked a little bit about both sides of the relationship that I call e-friendship, and I want to turn finally to concerns about robot-human friendship and try to answer them. One concern with e-friendship is that it's fake and deceptive. Elder, for example, holds that sociable robots deceive us with false appearances and false appearances of friendship in particular, but they create what she calls a counterfeit currency. She worries that social robots create what she calls moral hazards, especially when offered to people vulnerable to deceit. As she's referring to children on the autism spectrum, but other examples might include the kinds of populations we're talking about, people who are socially isolated and lonely, or older adults, for example, with dementia. Are these vulnerable populations in the sense that they're more susceptible to deceit? And if they are, is that troubling? In reply, I would say, even if e-friendship masquerading as human friendship, the so-called philia type friendship, would be fake, this is not what e-friendship is. Instead, remember, the proposal is that relationships with robots can be authentic friendships of a different type, the so-called agape type. A second concern is artificially intelligent systems feign mental and emotional capacities they don't really have. In short, they don't care about us. Koeckelberg observes that it's unlikely that in the foreseeable future, robots will have real mental states or consciousness. And he cautions that this makes them potentially risky friends since they lack empathy. In reply, e-friendship does not require robots to actually have mental or emotional capacities. Again, it involves one-directional affectionate regard, which enables a valued relationship of which robots are part. Finally, it might be objected that robot-human friendship is really inferior to the human-human type. So we should not focus on creating this inferior type of relationship. Sparrow suggests this line of reasoning when he says that rather than researching fancy robots to entertain and comfort the elderly, we should be working to establish social institutions that integrate them into the community and provide them with opportunities for contact with others. In reply, what ultimately matters with respect to our robot-human relationships is not the internal affective states of robots, but rather their expressive behavior. Do they create a care environment which would be formed by gestures, movements, and articulations that express attentiveness and responsiveness to vulnerabilities within the relevant context? And I would be happy to return to these concerns during the discussion. I want to mention a few more, which I think are very important when we're talking about designing robots for e-friendship. They relate primarily to designing robots in ways that preserve features of social relationships that we value without unintentionally creating adverse effects that would be harmful. So we should ask questions such as the following. Is one effect of creating e-friendships that we're reducing human contact? I don't think that's inevitable. I don't see this as an either or, but we should pay attention to that. Are we reducing human contact? And the population that I was discussing is a population that lacks human contact. We could, for example, take Sparrow up on his proposal that we should change our social institutions, but I don't think that precludes the possibility and the importance, in fact, of introducing other sources of relationship and connection. We should also be careful that we're not creating machine dependency. That's a related concern. If people have only a robot to relate to, that can create machine dependency. We should also be careful about who information is shared with and whether eFriend is putting privacy at risk. We should be sure not to exacerbate the digital divide. We should be sure that when we're talking about really basic healthcare needs, that there is access among a broad range of the population. And then also we should avoid, of course, creating algorithmic biases, which is a real concern when we feed big data into devices to train them, that we're really using data that reflects the population that will be the end user, and that we're not introducing stereotypes or biases about those populations. So in conclusion, I suggested that social isolation and loneliness pose serious threats to human health. Social robots can help address this by functioning as our e-friends. And e-friendship is a promising way to improve health and well-being, especially for people who live alone and feel lonely. Thank you very much for your attention, and I apologize about the difficulty with the screen there.
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, for a very interesting and thought-provoking initial discussion of the subject. We'll come back to some discussions and questions later on. But let me first proceed to introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker, Professor Anita Ho, is a bioethicist and health services researcher with a combined academic training and experience in philosophy, public health, and business. She is currently an associate professor at the Center for Applied Ethics at the University of British Columbia and the bioethics program at the University of California, San Francisco. She is a scientist at the Center for Health Evaluation and Outcome Sciences, and also the regional director of ethics in Northern California for Providence Health. She's an international scholar, and her research focuses on ethical dimensions of utilizing innovative and AI technologies in healthcare, domestic and global health disparity, supportive decision-making, and end-of-life care decisions. She's currently working on a book manuscript on AI health monitoring ethics, and this is related to her speech today, her lecture today, to be published by Oxford University Press. She is also working on a project on the use of digital monitoring during the COVID pandemic. Today, she'll share with us the topic, Live Like Nobody is Watching, Paradoxes in AI Home Health Monitoring. So let me pass the time to Anita. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I may have to apologize in advance that I'm at an airport hotel in Seattle and my internet has been going in and out, but hopefully it will be okay. And do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really my pleasure and honor to be with all of you here. And I want to also particularly thank Professor Derek Au and Ms. Joey So in putting this together. And I want to also acknowledge that a big part of my work is with Dr. Martin McEwen and Itai Bafley at the University of British Columbia. One of the projects that we're working on right now is being funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research on looking at how AI health monitoring may help people with Parkinson's disease. And as Professor Au also mentioned, I'm also working on a project right now on health monitoring during the COVID pandemic. And I definitely want to thank Lucy Randall from Oxford University Press in her patience while I finish my manuscript on this issue. So I want to start by telling you a story, and I'm curious what you might think about this. Right before the pandemic, a friend of mine told me about the situation with his mother when I told him about this book project I'm working on. So his mother has Alzheimer's disease and is living in an assisted living facility in California. And as she's starting to lose her memory on many different things, she starts thinking that people have been entering her apartment. She was telling my friend that somehow her things have been moved and she's not sure who has been coming to her place. And she's very anxious about it. So my friend thinks that it's probably actually herself who was the one who actually moved the objects, just that she didn't remember doing that. But he wasn't able to really convince her about that. And so he asked the family doctor, what should he do about it? And the doctor said that, well, perhaps one thing you could do is put a video camera in her unit so then they can record what exactly is happening when she is around or not around. And if at any point that she's thinking that something is happening to her place, perhaps you can show her the video footage. And at that time, then she can see that actually nobody was at her place. It's really she herself who actually moved her things. And so the family physician is certainly thinking that this may be actually a way to help reassure her patients about that. So I wonder, that's not what I wanted to do. I want to see if I can actually get your thoughts on this. What do you think about the doctor's suggestion? Would you, if it was for you, would you agree with the doctor's suggestion that this would be a good idea to use some kind of a video device to see whether anybody has been actually entering the person's place? Because this may be a way to give the patient some kind of feedback in terms of what may have been happening. Just give a couple more seconds here. It's interesting to see that people are kind of split on this. And so maybe I can tell you what my friend actually thought about that. So quite interesting here, and thank you for participating. So he thought, well, actually, I don't really, oh, I guess I should share the result, that about a little more than half of you thought that, yes, it would be a good idea. The others said, no, it's not. My friend decided that he didn't want to do it. The reason why he didn't want to do it, he thought he was the power of attorney for his mother. So he actually got to make many decisions for her. But he really felt like, would it be better for her to be actually watched by the video camera and that we show her the result later? So he was really trying to think, would that be actually a way of her seeing that her privacy has been violated? And even though the physician was definitely very well-meaning, my friend also wondered, what if it was the case that we would show her and tell her that actually it was you who moved the stuff, nobody came? Would she actually feel worse when then she finally realized that other people have been seeing what exactly she was or wasn't able to do? Would that in some ways be more damaging because of her privacy and people not trusting her and actually monitoring what she is doing? So I thought that was actually quite interesting. But he also said that, well, but he found it actually difficult to resist what the doctor was saying, partly because of the power dynamic as well. And especially because his mother really wanted to live on her own. And if this was supposedly something that could help, shouldn't we at least consider that? So in the next 25 minutes or so, I want to think a little bit about how we actually think about healthy aging and independent living in the big data world, and especially when we think more and more about how to use innovative technologies to support people's ability to live on their own. Certainly, there are many needs that are not being met, particularly in places where we do have an aging population. So is AI technology really the answer to that? And I would present some examples that have been proposed and also talk about some possible paradoxes at 3 different and intersecting levels: at the individual familial level, professional level, and then also at the structural systemic level. And then I will give some preliminary remarks in terms of how we may be able to address or resolve these paradoxes by centering people's care needs in the broader context. So healthy aging is certainly a big thing these days. Though there are many ways that people talk about how to make sure that we are staying healthy, focusing on avoiding diseases, disabilities, and maintaining our physical functioning, as well as a mental functioning. Part of the idea is to really get people actively engaged in their daily life, also mentally speaking, to make sure that they are thinking through their own daily living, and perhaps also be as engaged in maintaining our own health as possible. In many ways, it's almost a moralizing framework of asking people to really be engaged and improve their own health so that they don't have to decline. And this really contrasts with how many people in the disability community or disability scholars that talk about how there's almost this pendulum that's swinging so far that we're really trying to think about impairment and a life of dependency as something pathetic, unfulfilled, and as something that we want to avoid at all costs. And in many ways, that's actually what empirical studies are showing too, that many people, including people in Hong Kong, would consistently say that they want to live independently and age in place, meaning the aging in their own home, in their own community. And they want to avoid being burdens on others, whatever burden means. But if we look at the demographic reality, there may be questions in terms of whether people can do that. If you look at the bar on the very left, and this is the elderly population and elderly support ratio in Hong Kong. There's data collected in 2019. In 2018, the number of people, elderly people, over the age of 65 was about 1.2 million. But if you look across the x-axis here, you can see the numbers are going up. So there are certainly questions in terms of how we would be able to continue to care for aging adults in this changing demographics. This is particularly when we look at the elderly support ratio in the right side of this chart. The elderly support ratio represents the number of persons that are aged 15 to 64 per older adults aged 65 and above. What that means is that the more younger people we have, the more possibility that these people could support an aging adult. So in 2018, almost 4 people, 4 younger adults in comparison to the older adults, but that number is going to decrease to 2.36 in 2028 and continue to decline. So this certainly raises different questions in terms of how elderly people may be able to support themselves and who may be the ones that would be able to support them. What you see in this chart is the share of elderly population. Even though you will often hear that there is an aging population on a global scale, but the highlighted squares really show you that in some places, including Hong Kong and Japan, actually have a much higher percentage or share of people who are elderly as we go through the next couple decades, increasing, for example, in Hong Kong from almost 18% in 2018 to almost 32% in 2038. So that really raises questions in terms of what do we need to do to prepare for elder care. One cohort study looking at patients of primary care clinics that was done in 2019 show that out of these more than 1,000 participants, the chronic conditions, the mean number of chronic conditions is more than 4. And more than 1/3 of the participants also would sometimes forget taking medications. So there are questions in terms of how would we make sure that people are able to be reminded of medications and so on. More than 90% of these people had attended general outpatient clinics at least once in the past 12 months. And basically I was trying to get at how there have been discrepancy between aging adults' care preferences and the realities that they are facing. This is especially when there are longer life expectancy and that the impairments may actually make it such that people would really need other people to help them with their daily functioning. Are you seeing my screen? Just to make sure that you are.
Yes, very well.
Okay, great. But especially with the increasing number of people with dementia or other kinds of health needs as well, that there are certainly questions in terms of whether people can actually stay at their home safely. I was quite surprised when I saw the statistics that 15% of people in Hong Kong aged over 80 actually live in care homes, being one of the highest proportions in the world, even though there's often the assumption that in Asia, people would be cared for by their loved ones at home. So there certainly may be questions in terms of how do we actually make sure that there would be continuous observation for older adults who may be experiencing degenerative conditions and may require substantial monitoring and care. This is particularly challenging when we have what is sometimes called the sandwich generation, people who are caring for their elderly parents, but they may also have children that they are also caring for as well. Many older adults cannot afford to have professional care aides, and so the family members often would have to be the ones taking on a lot of this care work. But there's also a lot of statistics now showing that there's substantial caregiver burnout, including a study that compares the situation in Hong Kong and New Zealand, showing that more than 15% of family members reporting burnout caring for the family members with dementia. And in terms of being female, having lower activities of daily functioning and strong family values also can predict higher levels of caregiver burdens as well. So there are certainly questions in terms of whether we can use artificial intelligence to help in taking care of some of this work. Right now, there are a lot of other kinds of wellness products that are direct-to-consumers products, diagnostic and treatment algorithms, and other mobile and home devices that may be able to help to take on some of that work. Some of you may have already had some of these mobile wearable devices. And this lamp at the bottom of the screen here is one that supposedly can detect people having mobility problems and that can then light up more to help the person to be able to see better. You can also send alerts if somebody has fallen. And supposedly the AI can also tell whether the person has fallen versus just rolling over in the bed. So a big part of the idea with AI monitoring is to going back to that idea of self-management in healthy aging, that people would take charge of their own life to anticipate and discover if they have any health problems. Supposedly, the use of these or at least the hope is that the use of these technologies will help to enhance patient and consumer engagement that can hopefully also promote higher quality care and health outcomes. In general, they may think that, well, there may be other ways of doing remote monitoring, but if it is remote monitoring that's done by humans, it may still be very labor intensive and prone to errors. So the person has to constantly be watching. With artificial intelligence, you may be able to use the algorithm to actually collect and analyze the longitudinal data from the person, and then categorize and see what is happening to the person over time. You may be able to use the predictive analytics to assess whether the person is now declining or whether the person is staying stable, and use that information to make behavioral or care recommendations. So the picture on the right is showing a technology that allows a person to basically just use fingerprints to test various kinds of vital signs. But it also can work as other kinds of home devices, can play videos and so on. So it can be integrated into an older person's daily life. But the question is really whether we can use these types of technologies to reduce family care burden and increase or improve older adults' ability to live safely at home. So this, let me see if I can actually play this. It doesn't really seem to be doing that. So this is actually the project that we are working on right now that actually helps to show, so basically this is the visual, the computer vision program that is actually trying to track people's movement. But the idea is that you can really see whether the older adults, for example, may be walking in less steady kinds of ways. And then the square is really to show the facial expression that's supposedly allowing the AI to actually see whether the person's facial expression may be showing more depression and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we can use computer vision to help to see whether a person may actually be changing in terms of their health status. So I want to see if I can ask you a second question now. So this technology is supposedly for Parkinson's patients. If your loved one had Parkinson's disease, I know you couldn't see the whole technology there, do you think that you would want them to actually use this technology? Supposedly, it can help to see whether the person's functioning status might be changing or not, or the facial expression may be indicating the mood, and that supposedly is going to suggest whether the person is declining or staying about the same. So it seems that most people who are participating in this are thinking that you would like to use this if your loved one had Parkinson's. Okay, thank you for that. So that was the result there. And then I want to see whether you think the same way. If it was for yourself, if you had Parkinson's, so not your loved one now, if you had Parkinson's disease, would you want to use this technology? So that to show whether you might be declining or not. It's interesting that in both of these cases, that people seem to be quite willing to actually be engaging in using this technology. So one of the reasons why I'm asking that is to see whether people have any sense in terms of how would they think about their expectations versus the expectations for their loved one. So I gave some examples in terms of how we may use AI health monitoring. And now I want to introduce 3 possible levels of paradoxes at the individual and familial care relationship level, professional level, and at the structural level. At the individual level, I think it's very interesting when people think about using any kind of monitoring. In general, going back to my friend's situation, he was very concerned that his mother may not be actually consenting to this. And if the mother is not consenting to this, then how could we actually use this in an ethical kind of way? But of course, for many patients, especially if they have dementia, the consent capacity and the monitoring needs are actually an inverse relationship. It's especially when people have less capacity to consent that it's possible that their care needs may be higher. So how do we reconcile that? There may also be questions in terms of whether older adults may have different risk perceptions and tolerance compared to their family members. So their family members might think that They want to be very careful about their loved ones, but people themselves may actually think that they would be much more willing to take certain levels of risk. When I say taking the risk, is without being monitored. So there are also questions that we have to think about, especially if we're using health monitoring at home, how that may affect the family dynamics. Professor Jekyll talks about the e-friends, but could the use of AI health monitoring in some ways exacerbate older adults' isolation and loneliness if it is being used as a way to replace the human interaction or the human monitoring? There's some studies that also start to ask the question in terms of whether some technologies to make themselves useful, they actually have to give various kinds of alerts. But sometimes the frequent alerts may actually increase caregiver burdens. So it may be the case that the family members generally would call the parents to ask how they're doing once an evening. But then now when there are different and frequent alerts, it may actually lead to more caregiver burdens and anxiety. There may also be different questions in terms of whether caregivers may have the same kind of priorities and concerns as the older adults being monitored. So I think that these technologies certainly raise questions in terms of how to think about the relational meaning of autonomy at a home caregiving setting. And should we only think about the autonomy of the older adults being monitored? At a therapeutic level, there are also other kinds of relational considerations. Eric Topol has a book, the title is something like How AI Can Make Healthcare More Human Again. And I want to ask that question, whether that really would be the case, especially when a lot of the AI monitoring technologies are really quantifying human experiences. And in particular, currently, there is still very minimal training of AI in professional education, including in medical education. There may also be questions in terms of whether patients who are the worried wells may be taking any kind of alerts back to the physicians. So in some ways, it may once again actually increase the burden of the clinical encounters as well, if patients have a lot of questions coming from the algorithms. There are also questions that we need to ask whether the perceived more objective or more accurate information from algorithms would also challenge people when clinicians or patients may actually want to reject the recommendation coming from the algorithm. I think that the AI health monitoring may really be changing the care delivery practices and possibly inadvertently adding more burdens on patients and families, just like it's adding more burden on hosts of webinars as well. So from a structural perspective here, we also have to think about other kinds of relational considerations. May technologies perpetuate various kinds of structural inequalities? So people who may not be able to afford in-person care may also have questions in terms of whether they can afford various kinds of AI technologies. And is it also the case that because of government fundings that we are moving to AI technologies, even though people may have more of a preference of using in-person technology? And there may also be questions in terms of how do we think about various classes of people who may be deemed to be at more higher risk, so that they must be monitored regardless of their own personal desires or risk acceptance. And if we are moving monitoring outside of the clinical setting into people's homes, then there are also changing meanings in terms of what home and privacy might mean, and especially when people may now be under constant gaze in a very confined environment. There are also questions in terms of whether we think that this is really promoting people's autonomy when they may not have a way to actually choose whether they can refuse to have AI monitoring, especially if there are no other kinds of in-person monitoring alternatives being available. Many people say that at a system level that we are democratizing information when we use various kinds of technologies like this, because people can access their own information and access even recommendations at home. But there may be also the double-edged sword that we have to think about, that there may also be questions. For example, some of our participants are asking who now may also have access to their health information. Would companies now be the ones owning their information rather than patients themselves? So I think that in this new technological era, we really have to ask questions in terms of whether AI may actually exert more power and control over people's lives. Especially during the COVID pandemic, we are relying a lot on technologies, We're assuming that they are the solutions to many problems that we have, but that may really reshape the cultural meanings of personal responsibilities and what it means for patients being empowered. The patients don't really have a choice, but have to actually resort to these technologies that may actually raise various kinds of questions about what it means for people to be empowered in their aging and in their quest for independent living. There may be questions in terms of also whether the healthcare funding or financing, ways of fixing the problems actually may lead to more paternalism for people, because we are telling them that you would not be able to get other kinds of benefits until you are actually being monitored at home. So some of our participants in that Parkinson's study have been asking the question of whether the technology that we are talking about, for example, if they are showing that the person's health status hasn't changed very much, would that mean that their neurologist would not see them as frequently, even though in Canada, the so-called frequently is actually only once a year. So there are definitely many questions that we have to think about, I believe, in terms of how we think about AI recommendations as well, whether that may obscure various kinds of power and control at the individual, professional, and system levels. And especially in many parts of the world, that people are also worried about being monitored inside and outside of the home in various kinds of social settings already. How may this also come into play when we think about more and more types of surveillance happening? So in trying to resolve or address at least some of these paradoxes, I think that there are three different levels that we need to think about. At the system level, how do we actually make sure that we are still investing at the basic information and basic access to various kinds of care that people want to be able to go to? And this may also be about how do we not only invest in digital and innovative technologies, but also think about how do we also invest in the health workforce and family support so that we really have ways to ease their burden. At the professional level, we also have to ask fundamental questions in terms of how do we also promote technological literacy, even in the medical and professional education curriculum. Because as I mentioned earlier, very often physicians are not the ones helping to develop some of these technologies and may also not know how to actually advise their patients when patients are possibly presenting with some of these options as well. And we also need to rethink what exactly the goal of using AI technologies might be in the therapeutic relationship. Is it to replace? Is it really to enhance the consultation that patients may have with the human clinicians? And then at the individual level, which is also possibly where the technological level is, because the technologies are going to be used for people. When we're designing various kinds of technologies, are we co-designing with older adults and the prospective caregivers who may be most affected? And if we are really trying to promote independent living, we need to also know what exactly are older adults' own priorities and goals, whether they are supported by technologies or not. And so only with that in mind that we can really use technologies as a tool and translate those priorities, whether it's in relation to privacy or still the connections with the family members into the technological development. So I think that in addressing these paradoxes, that we really need to think about not starting with where we want to be with the technologies, but what exactly our goals might be in supporting the aging population. And so that start from that ground up and involve stakeholders as much as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Anita. We enjoy your lecture real well. We are obviously immediately coming to some of the focus which would generate some responses and discussions. And I'd like to take this occasion to this time to introduce our two discussants. I'll do that in one go so as not to further interrupt the flow of the discussions and the responses. Our first discussant today is Professor Han Meng. Han is a CHK colleague, Patrick Huynh Meng Professor of Systems Engineering and Engineering Management in our university. Her research interests includes AI for speech and language technologies to support multilingual and multimodal human-computer interactions, as well as big data decision analytics. She leads the interdisciplinary research team that receives the first theme-based research scheme project in AI in 2019 from the Hong Kong Government's Research Grant Council. She is also the head of the curriculum development team in CHK, in the CHK Geography Club AI for the Future project, which has developed the courseware for pre-tertiary AI education being taught in a growing number of participating secondary schools in Hong Kong. She's a really renowned scholar in her field. Her background is she received her education at MIT and has founded the CHK Ministry of Education and Microsoft Key Laboratory of the Human-Centered Computing Interface Technologies in Hong Kong, and a number of other projects. She received many awards from different parties, and also serves as an elected member of a group for the Children AI working group. She is also a fellow of the international bodies, IEEE, ICA, and other institutions in her field. So today we are very privileged to have Helen to be our first discussant. And the second discussant is Professor Alexandra Eller, a colleague of mine in the background of philosophy. He studies the ethical implications of new technologies with the potential to significantly transform society and human condition, including genetic interventions and interventions into the brain. He completed his PhD at the Oxford University and is now a research assistant professor in philosophy and bioethics at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He has written on various issues raised by the emerging technologies, including their potential impact on human identity and authenticity. His work has been published in many peer-reviewed journals internationally. So he and both of our speakers as our discussants. I'll exit my introduction and pass the time to Helen for the first discussion.
Yeah.
Helen, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Derek. And I'd like to thank Nancy and Anita for two wonderful presentations, and I've learned a lot from them, and it's really nice to be able to see the problem of AI being applied in interacting with human and also with older adult subjects from your perspective. So it's a very refreshing and informative period that I've spent just now. So I'd like to share some of my views and perhaps maybe raise some interesting points for discussion. So first, starting with Nancy's presentation, I think it is very good that you advocate the use of AI in building e-friendship. And in fact, my background, I work, as you know, I work on spoken language technologies. I develop speech recognition systems. So on the input side, we look at acoustic phonetics, and not only that, we look at the words being spoken. We look at even the choice of words from the speaker, so as to try to infer the sentiment of the speaker, the emotions of the speaker. We also try to infer sentiments and emotions from the tone of voice and maybe even the speaking rate, etc. And then we also try to, on the flip side, work on technologies for speech output, so text-to-speech synthesis, and in fact, what sometimes we call emotive text-to-speech synthesis, in order for the expression of the synthetic voice to carry the appropriate, perhaps the emotions that are congruent with the content. And then between speech input and speech output, there is a whole lot of technologies on natural language processing, where we try to build technologies on natural language understanding the intent, the concepts brought forth by the user through the string of words that has been uttered in the speech input. And we also try to monitor the dialogue history. So in a conversation between two parties, one being the human user, the other being the AI, in fact, what we call the conversational system, the AI system, we want to be able to keep track of the dialogue turns. So, the speech from the human coming in, and then the speech, and then being processed, and then the AI will generate the response, and then the process continues. So we try to keep track of the dialogue history in order to bring the interaction forward. So there was a lot of points on interaction, and of course, Nancy's talk covered many different modalities of interactions. I will comment specifically on perhaps speech-based interactions, because when we build conversational agents, conversational AI, which can carry on a dialogue with the human user, what we actually like to do is a spectrum of things. One is sometimes what we call task-oriented dialogue. So the idea is to allow the human user to speak, and then speak with the conversational system. And at the end of the day, at the end of the conversation, a task is completed. It could be like ordering a pizza, or buying movie tickets, or maybe even booking a flight or booking a hotel. There are lots of such applications. And the other end of the spectrum is more like a chatbot. So it's more carry on and interaction, and it could be, basically it's just an engagement. So one can go between these two ends of the spectrum, as in a voice, as in a virtual assistant, as you mentioned. So if I may offer a viewpoint from the engineering perspective, in fact, when we develop such technologies, AI is completely dependent on data, big data, and our machine learning algorithms that tries to capture the patterns and trends that are in the data. And of course, these machine learning algorithms and the data needs a lot of computing and storage. So we need those resources in the cloud, but we'll leave those discussions for another day. And so in our field, there is a saying which is, there's no data like more data. So the more, the better. And the more data that is relevant for the task or the application at hand, the better. And I also want to put forth this point: if the data does not capture, or because data is always noisy, we never see very clean trends. We see a diversity of trends, and that's what the machine learning algorithm learns. So sometimes the trends that are captured and that gets invoked in the machine's decision and prediction may not always be perfect. In fact, oftentimes it's not perfect. And in fact, we as engineers, we don't have direct control of the exact decision that is output from the machine. We can tune and we can adapt the machine learning algorithms, but at the end of the day, the trained system, what we call the trained system, its behavior is also very much dependent on the data that it gets for training. So with that in mind, I want to say that when we build conversational agents, there is oftentimes, aside from accuracy in, for example, speech recognition, you can measure how many words have been recognized correctly. So that is very objective. But then there is also whether or not the system is attractive or engaging enough to carry the dialogue forward, right? So oftentimes we want to design a system that can have increased user engagement. So how do you increase user engagement? You try to you try to grab onto the user and try to be helpful and try to be responsive. And maybe even try to show empathy. When I say empathy, I can give you a bit of information. A lot of the times, the data that goes into training the conversational AI are written very, how should I say, written with deep thought in how to express a certain, how to word a certain utterance to show empathy, right? And of course, there are other more objective algorithms like sentiment analysis, which I mentioned. So the objective is user engagement. How do we design the technologies and integrate the technologies in order to gain user engagement? And indeed, one of the objectives is anthropomorphic design, so that the conversation agent can perhaps appear to be more human-like. But at the same time, I think as a technologist, we're very much aware. I mean, depending on which camp you're on, whether you want to build technologies that you want to push the front so that it's almost indistinguishable from a human, or sometimes we want to adopt another approach that you want the technology to be sophisticated, to be helpful, but at the end of the day, you want the human user to be aware that it's still a technology. So it's inanimate, right? So I think the caution that Nancy's talk put forward in counterfeit currency, and that we don't want users to be too susceptible to deceit, I feel it's very important. So on the one hand, we do try to feign some human characteristics, but at the same time, I think we due to the limitations of today's even state-of-the-art technology, we can only do it to a certain extent, but we can also inject in the design to remind the user that, by the way, you're talking to a machine. Okay, so I think that balance is very important. Now, just to share with you where the state-of-the-art technology can place itself. Many of you have heard of the Microsoft Shell Ice chatbot, and there was a recent paper that was published, and it presented the data on perhaps the longest conversations that users have conducted with Shell Ice or Shell Bing, right? So there are two modes. One is full duplex by voice, and in China, the longest, according to the logs, the longest conversation actually lasted for 6 hours and 3 minutes, and the conversation touched on 8 application domains, 53 topics, and 16 tasks. So that is rather mind-boggling, I think. Now, on the other modality of message-based conversations, so the data came from Japan, China, and the US. Okay, so in Japan, it was found that message-based conversations, the longest recorded conversation was 17 hours and 7 minutes. And it included 2,400 dialogue turns. So dialogue turns means if you have two interlocutors, one person speaks one thing, one utterance, the other speaks another utterance, that's, that will be 2 dialogue turns, okay?
And I'm going to invite you to keep the time.
Sure, 2 to 3 more minutes, yes.
If you have points for Nancy and Nita.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so let me cut it short. And so for China, it's 24 hours, 33 minutes. And for the US, it's also 23 hours, 43 minutes. So this is really long. Now, that comes to the point where, the question I want to present for Nancy is, when we consider anthropomorphic design as engineers and technologists, where do you see the balance, right? Whether we want to build an AI system that is as human-like as possible, or whether we should try to put in sort of a safety valve that every now and then we can remind the user that you're talking to the machine, right? Another point is from these data that I just presented, all of us only have 24 hours in a day. So if we have such engagement, is it a blessing or a curse, right? When we interact with these chatbots. Okay, so I'm going to Anita's talk. So I actually also work on a project which is to design AI technologies to extract spoken language biomarkers. So from speech, to extract these speech and language characteristics that may be indicative of neurocognitive decline. And I think your talk pointed out well, because we have a global population that is rapidly aging, and that brings around a lot of disease, the needs for disease management or chronic disease management, and these have high costs and disease burdens for public health. Now, what AI can do, I must say, is, in fact, we're still developing the technology. So some of it can be quite sophisticated. What AI can do is, again, train on big data and try to perform classification, whether someone shows healthy cognitive functioning or mild cognitive decline, or maybe Alzheimer's disease. So, but what AI can do is to offer a very accessible, economical, and perhaps 24/7 longitudinal frequent monitoring, as you say. And in fact, that is important for collection of big data to train the AI models to be able to make the necessary decisions for that may inform the need for care. And so I think the technology itself perhaps is just a tool. And I think it is important. I actually like your the end part of your talk where you pointed out it is very important that we need to bring together all the stakeholders to co-design an application or a solution, because the AI makes decisions, but the decisions are often not perfect, as I mentioned. It depends on the kinds of data that you train the algorithms on, and whether the data has noise or whether there's corrupted data, etc. So one must not take the decisions of AI as always correct. But it does have a lot of data. It does have a lot of computation power. However, the design of a solution really needs to take care of the human-centric characteristics, like you say, having the appropriate consent and having the users know the, not only the benefits but also the pitfalls of the technology. So I think AI itself is certainly not a panacea. And I think it needs a crowd. We need interdisciplinary, a crowd of the stakeholders to come together to design a good solution that can balance across the different kinds of interests. Hopefully, to address your the three paradoxes that you presented.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. So that was a very rich response. It touches on the issue of designing to be elder-centric, perhaps, and also for Nancy, the issue of whether do you really want the design to be totally animate or human-like. So we'll pick up on that response later on. But let me now pass the time on to Alex. Alex, I apologize. We are overrunning slightly, so I hope you keep your time in your response.
Thank you, Derek. So sure, I will be brief in my remarks, but let me begin by thanking in my turn the two speakers for your stimulating talks and also for sharing your slides before the event. That was certainly helpful for me to think about what you presented. Let me begin. So I'll just offer a few thoughts to promote discussion. And so let me begin with Professor Checker's presentation. So you mentioned these interesting issues which also sort of intersect with some of the work I'm doing in a somewhat different context of so-called neurointerventions. So there's this concern about the lack of truthfulness or authenticity of some of these potential e-friendships. And one first question that came to my mind was, in response to this potential concern, you mentioned that e-friendships do not purport to be some kind of actual human friendship and sort of masquerading as something that they're not, but rather that they were their own kind of thing, and to that extent that they were not deceitful. One might still worry or ask, though, whether there isn't some form of deception involved or of something misleading to the extent that a robot would express certain emotions towards a patient or would express mental states of any kind. Given that you also mentioned that currently it seems we don't seem to have good reasons to attribute any such things, any such mental states to robots. So to the extent that a robot would, through their behavior, express such things, one might think that this is somewhat misleading. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily unethical, all things considered, even to have this practice if it has good, health outcomes or psychological outcomes, but it could be sort of a grain of truth in the concern. That would be one question I would have for you. Another one concerns your what you said about Rob Sparrow's critique and suggestion that maybe we should think more about how to socialize elderly patients who suffer from their social situation rather than relying on e-friendships. And one reason, so one question I have is whether, to what extent there is really a disagreement between you and Sparrow, because you also mentioned at the end of your talk that we should make sure when developing these opportunities for e-friendships that we should do so to reduce social isolation without reducing human contact, to quote what you said. And one might think that this means you actually maybe agree with Sparrow that these relationships are not on a par with human friendships. They are sort of a fallback option when we cannot have a human friendship, when a person might not benefit from a human friendship, then let's give them this other opportunity to avoid the undesirable option, which is no friendship whatsoever. In which case, if that's what you think, then there might be not be a very strong gap between you and Sparrow. But I think it partly depends on how you understand this idea of not reducing human contact. So as you mentioned, we are talking about people who are socially isolated. There's also a question of what the target group is here. Is it only elderly people who are socially isolated might have some maybe disabilities, physical disabilities? Is it a broader social group that you think would benefit from these e-friendships, other people from other groups suffering from social isolation? But so that one question is, you could say, well, this person lacked real friendships. So if we give them an e-friendship, they are benefiting. We're giving them something when before they had nothing. But another way to look at this would be to say, well, sure, they don't currently have enough human friendships, but we could try and devise societies so as to make it easier for them to develop new human friendships. And so there would be opportunity costs. So if we give this person an e-friendship and that means they don't get a new human friendship they could otherwise have had, we are reducing human contact in a different sense. So here I would be interested in hearing how you understood this notion of reducing human contact. Maybe I can stick to these points for Professor Jacker's talk. So moving on to Professor Ho's talk, one question I had was the extent to which perhaps bringing your talk together with Professor Jacker's talk, one might wonder whether you are looking at different timelines, or to what extent are you looking at different timelines for the application of AI to caregiving as opposed to different applications. So one might think, for example, that robot caregivers would be sort of a natural next step beyond remote health monitoring. And so that what you have looked at is a more present day application of AI for that purpose, but that what Professor Jacker talked about would be a logical next step for similar purposes. And you mentioned the problem of social isolation. So one might think that today we still have technological limitations, but we're already seeing robot caregivers introduced in some nursing homes. I presume that with enough technological development, there would be a possibility of having them to care for people in their own homes, perhaps in addition to some, of course, there would still be, I guess, the need for some monitoring, including monitoring of what the robot is doing, but so that the adults would have this sort of physical presence in their own home. So is this sort of the next logical step? And related to this, one might wonder to what extent in this context are we talking about developments that we should just try to manage as best as we can, but that we have to foresee will occur anyway because of a certain combination of social and economic forces. So you mentioned, for example, the unaffordability of professional caregivers for many people, which would be sort of one of kind of a natural solution for people who are concerned about these questions of social isolation, but might think, well, reliance on AI is suboptimal. It's better if there is human contact. It's better if there is a human person to provide caregiving to those who need it. So there's a question, to what extent is this a social choice that we can make to try and have less reliance on AI in the future and encourage reliance on actual human beings if we think that this is desirable? Or to what extent is this perhaps unrealistic given sort of the economic constraints that you have mentioned, coupled with the expected rising, the need for caregiving that you have also outlined in some of the data that you've shown us. So I guess I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. So I will first invite Nancy to respond to the comments and remarks.
And Erler very much for their comments. Those are really interesting perspectives, and I appreciate the specifics I want to address. And if I don't do justice to this, please feel free to come back and ask me to clarify. But one of the central concerns that I heard both of you express had to do with this idea of deception. And it clearly is an important concern in the literature. It's one of the objections I addressed briefly in my presentation, and I'm happy to have an opportunity to come back and circle back to that. So the way that Professor Meng expressed this is, should we make social robots as human-like as possible, or should we put in a safety valve to remind the user that you're talking to a machine? So if we're not purporting to have a human-human friendship, but a robot-human friendship, should we make a point of being transparent about that? And Professor Erler raised the concern, pressed the point, saying that even if they're not the same kind of thing, they're feigning emotion, and it's easy to believe that they are emoting with us because they're socially intelligent, right? And they know how to do it well, and they're probably only going to get better. I want to reply, and I'm focused really on older adult populations. I sort of got interested in AI through the back door. I have a central focus on aging and aging well, aging with dignity. And I want to suggest that when we think about what values matter for this population, we shouldn't begin with the assumption that what matters most is what matters to people in midlife. I would argue that our values change across the lifespan. And if we're thinking about truth and deception, truth may not necessarily be the most important value. Of course, this is going to depend upon the individual older adult, but AI for older people should be elder-centered. If an older person has, for example, mid or late stage dementia, they might insist, I know someone who does, in fact, that their deceased loved one is coming to visit. And it's something they look forward to. It provides purpose and meaning in their life. And one can correct that mistake. But ultimately, we might decide that if asked, we'll tell the truth, but we won't press it. We won't press the truth. And the reason is that it's cruel. And we should show a kind of loving kindness toward that individual. And that is what they need to live well and to live with dignity. So I think truth figures centrally for some mature adults with decisional capacity who are focused on that, but it can have a diminishing importance for some people during later life. There's also, I think, a cultural component in this. But we should ask whether for some adults, especially those with dementia, affiliation or interacting matters more. And so it's going to depend upon the particular individual, but I don't think we should go into it with the assumption that it's bad not to press the truth, because I don't think that delivers the best care for some individuals. And that is not just in the area of AI, but in many other ways in which we interact with older people. This is also true at the other end of the lifespan. When interacting with small children, we encourage them to express themselves and use their imagination and play. And that's an important capability, human capability, and that also can figure prominently for some people in later life. So another concern that came up in Professor Meng's presentation was that algorithmic bias, which I mentioned briefly in closing, but really didn't say much about, except we need to be aware of it and we need to try to avoid that. The way she put the point is data is always noisy. We capture a diversity of trends, and the ones we select might not be perfect. One of the ways in which this comes out with older populations is the phenomenon of elder speak. And elder speak is a form of baby talk that's directed to older adults and that infantilizes them by using sort of a simple vocabulary, a sweetened affect, and repetitions. And if we feed into AI systems big data that shows people interacting with older adults in this manner, the system would learn rules for elder speak. And it would learn to use a kind of derogatory speech toward older adults, which would only, I think, replicate ageist stereotypes. Because it leads people to regard older adults' statements as non-serious and untrustworthy and unreliable, baby-like, basically. Baby talk is great for babies, but not so great for older adults. It's a way of downplaying them. It's a form of what philosophers call epistemic injustice. So I think we really do have to be careful, because if we can select human biases and stereotypes about a population, and one way to avoid that is to be conscious about it and to ask if we are doing that, because it's not inevitable, but it might be our default if we don't have systems to check for that. So I just wanted to, it's not really, I don't disagree. I think it's a big concern, and I'm glad there are smart people like Professor Meng that are focused on that and trying to figure out how to do that well. I think it's really important. And then I think there was one more question I wanted to address, and that overlaps also with a question that came up in the chat. It has to do with whether I really disagree or don't disagree with Professor Sparrow, who I referenced and quoted in my slides, when he says that we should really build social institutions that integrate socially isolated and lonely adults with other human beings rather than with robots. And my response to him was, it's not necessarily either or. So if it's not either or, I think that we agree. But how I understood what he was saying in that passage was that this is what we ought to be doing, and by default, what we should not be doing is trying to develop friendships. My own view is that these technologies are already a part of our life. They're ubiquitous, and they will be more so. We will be interacting with machines increasingly in the future. So the question is, how do we want to go about that in a way that preserves values of social interaction that we hold dear, that we care about, that we want to preserve? And we will have these interactions one way or another. And if we're deliberate about trying to do it in a way that meets people's needs and that is responsive to their situation, I think we'll have a sort of robot-human interaction that we can actually value for its own sake. If you have someone who's helping you as a service robot, or a machine that's helping as a service robot and helping to feed you because you need assistance with that activity of daily living, do you want a mechanical device that's putting food in your mouth, or do you want someone that can engage with you in a way that is, makes you feel like you're not alone and feels good and is an interaction you enjoy, is playful, and they have information about you and they know you? I think ultimately users should decide, but to some extent we have to decide when we set up policies and set goals. So I hope I haven't taken up too much time. I want to thank Professor Meng and Professor Erler again for their insightful comments and feedback.
Thank you, Nancy, for the response. And time now to Anita.
Thank you so much, Professor Meng and Professor Erler. If I may also say something in relation to what Professor Checker was saying. And some of you may have read about this before too, that in Japan, that there are many elderlies who have been given these social bots, that when the social bots die, quote unquote die, because they're no longer working, that many of them would actually perform burial services. It's not necessarily that they were deceived in thinking this is a human or an animate object, but that they had formed some kind of attachments to some of these beings. So I think it's really interesting in terms of how do we actually think about the human emotions. I'm going to put in the chat box, some of you may have seen this, that talks about how, it was a news article that talks about how humans are hardwired in actually recognizing things that look like faces, and that we emotionally already respond to it, even though nobody is really thinking that this particular cheese grater is really human. So I think that those are really interesting questions. And to address a couple of points that Professor Meng and Professor Erler mentioned, I want to maybe come to the point first about being monitored 24/7 and whether that is a good thing or not. One of our participants in our research for Parkinson's talked about that. And in relation to how, well, sometimes we have to think about, do you want to always be being watched? We think that this is about safety and making sure that everyone is being monitored, and more, as you said, more data is always better. But there may be the privacy questions, right? That there may be situations when people say that I just don't want to be watched. If I am sad, whatever emotions I am experiencing, I want to be able to carry on my day without being continually watched. So one of the questions that participants had asked is, are there times when I can turn off the machine so that it's not monitoring me? Or can I also have some kind of control in thinking that, okay, I might have almost fallen, but I didn't really fall. I don't want the alert to be sent to my daughter. I don't want them to worry about it. So how do we actually design the machines in the human-centric way to see what exactly would the user's priorities be? It may not be always being watched. It may not be always being alerted by some of these events. So that may be a question to think about. In terms of whether it would be the next logical step, I mean, I think that's a really good question, because AI may be used exactly to replace the humans that we don't have. We would not have enough younger people to take care of the elderly people in certain societies. And so, but if it is the case, then we still have to, I guess, at this interim level, to really think about how do we actually make sure that these technologies are really user-centric. And because otherwise, I think that we are selling various kinds of promises to say that this can really do things better. But it may or may not be the case because of possibly data biases. But also, I think that we have to have that kind of honesty to say that this is perhaps a replacement that is not superior, but it may be perhaps what we need to have. And I think that the paradox that I face sometimes is that we are in this age of like techno solutionism, assuming it's always better. And selling it as always better. And I think that in some ways it could be better, it could be more efficient, it could be more effective, but there are other kinds of costs involved as well. And so in many ways, we have to at least balance that together. Because of time, maybe I'll stop there and I can come back to a couple of points.
Okay, thank you so much, Anita. We can take those points further in the discussion. But let me at this juncture open the time to the audience to see if there are any comments and questions from the audience. You can turn on your mic and speak directly if you anyone in the audience would like to make any comments, or you can simply type in your comments and remarks through the chat box, and I can also refer that to our speakers and discussants. Yes, time to the yes, Han.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I would like to thank both speakers, as well as the Professor Mann and also Alexander. My comment will be on, my question will be on Professor Nancy Schacker's presentation, which I found extremely interesting and rewarding. So my question is this. I was thinking the question, to what extent e-friendships differs from real, genuine friendship. The reason I ask this is, for one thing, it's good to understand that, right? What's the limitation of e-friendship compared with our normal friendship, and also this may also have a bearing on Sparrow's question. That is, to what extent should we, have a real old people's community instead of e-friendship, right? I mean, I agree with you that it's not an either or question, but when one considers trade-off, there may be, one may want to know to what extent e-friendships differ from or fall short of the genuine friendship. And I thought one thing that comes to my mind is friendship differs from an employer-employee relation, right? For example, I'm sure a robot can do many things for me. I can employ a robot as my secretary, as a worker, and so on. But friendship has this distinct quality of reciprocity, and by that I mean, if someone is my friend, I would expect that there be, a conversation or our caring for each other is reciprocal. But in this regard, I think the robot might fall short in a number of areas. For example, now my questions are not well thought out, but I'm thinking out. So the first.
Maybe I'll let Nancy respond first.
Let me give very quickly 3 points, and that is, the first point is, can a robot have an interest, right? Can it be self-interested? And also, to what extent can it have emotions stemming from such interests? The second is, can a robot be a moral agent? Can it, in particular, reason in terms of agent neutral and agent relative reason? And the third is, as a friend, I would expect my friend to, philosophical friend at least, to talk to me about my work. I suppose a robot can also offer me advice and comment and so on. Maybe one day I have to acknowledge a robot in my paper, but presumably a robot has no work, right? No paper to write on its own. So that would have to be a one-way kind of relation instead of reciprocal. Sorry for a long-winded question. Thank you.
Yes, Nancy.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your comments and question. So I actually thought you were going to go in a different direction because epistemologically, in terms of what we know and how we know it, we don't really know directly what others feel or think. We infer this usually in ordinary interactions based on their behavior. And we know that they, through fMRIs, we know there's certain kinds of activity that correlates with that, and they have a brain like ours. But we don't really know, and we can't really answer the skeptic's challenge. And in our interactions with a robot, they can be responsive to touch, to speech, to our nonverbal displays. They're increasingly socially intelligent. And so I think we can have a reciprocation at a similar level, but I'm pressing that we're not necessarily trying to create a faux human relationship. We're trying to be imaginative and be open to new ways of relating. I don't really know the answers to your questions. They're good ones, whether a robot can have an interest, emotions, and be a moral agent. I think we could spend a whole session on those questions. It depends on how we define them. But my focus is really on robots as socially interacting with us. There's been a lot of attention to autonomy and extending independence. But I think there are other values that have been sidelined in those conversations, and that this notion of affiliation and how to do it well in a robot-human exchange is really central to quality of life and to some of the concerns that have been neglected and we need to attend to more carefully.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions, remarks from our audience? I thought it's interesting from the discussion that it seems that on the one hand, we are worried that the robots are not a real friend, as not enough real anyway, not enough authenticity. But on the other hand, we are also slightly worried that they become too much like a real human and becomes either deceptive or going over. And similarly, on surveillance, we are on the one hand, we appreciate the attention from the surveillance, but we are a bit worried about the intrusion into the private sphere and the impact on the human self-control. Because time is running out, let's like to just close the seminar by thanking everyone. I'll also make a general remark that my observation is that the issues are not in the future. The future is in a really real way already here. In the field of elderly care, which I'm still having some affiliation, I've actually recently seen some prototypes or developments from Japan, where they combine the surveillance function and robot function and social robot functions in OH homes. So you can quite easily monitor the level of activities and movements, like what Anita showed in the presentation. And once you notice that the elder in the room is not having enough activities, then the robot can go and approach and try to talk to the elder to see if he or she needs something or is lonely or something. The other development, other design that I saw, which I had some problem with, was to actually monitor the sleep of the elders in OH homes at night. It's quite easily done. You put a pressure mat underneath each of the elders' beds, and you collect all the data. So when the fridges and turns and toss and turns at night and not sleeping well, then the central station would know, and the AI can analyze the sleep patterns and activities throughout the whole night of the elders to see if they are really actually sleeping or sleeping deep enough. Of course, that runs into some real concern about privacy, and I sort of reminded the friend who enthusiastically introduced to me that sometimes we just like to sleep alone, and elders in OH homes are not necessarily just doing sleep at night. they can do some very private activities, including sexual activities at night in the room. So do you really want to monitor every one of them at night to make sure that they're all right? So I just like to close by saying that really the future is here, and we'll be seeing more developments in the coming few years. And this will be a topic that would be really worth pursuing further, both as individual topics and also as cross-discipline dialogues and discussions or even collaborations. So with that, I thank Professor Jacka, Professor Ho, Helen, and Alex for this wonderful session conducted for us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, and see you hopefully in our second seminar that will be later this year, and that would focus on digital health and impacts on healthcare. Thank you very much, and goodbye.